Just hours after the European Parliament adopted a resolution criticizing Burkina Faso, the government of Captain Ibrahim Traore responded with a move that immediately captured attention across Africa and beyond. Instead of issuing a routine diplomatic statement, Burkina Faso summoned the European Union ambassador and delivered a direct message. The country expressed its disappointment, its disapproval, and what officials described as profound disgust toward a resolution they believe was built on misinformation and outdated assumptions. At the center of the controversy lies a simple but powerful question. Who gave the European Parliament the authority to judge a sovereign nation that is not even a member of the European Union? According to the resolution, Burkina Faso faces worsening security conditions, shrinking civic freedoms, and growing humanitarian challenges. European lawmakers argued that large portions of the country's territory remain outside government control and warned that instability in the Sahel could threaten the wider West African region. For many observers in Brussels, this was presented as a concern for democracy, human rights, and regional security. But in Ouagadougou, the reaction was very different. Officials argued that the resolution ignored the sacrifices made by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in their ongoing struggle against terrorism. They insisted that the document relied on inaccurate information and reflected a mindset that many Africans increasingly reject. What began as a parliamentary resolution quickly evolved into something much larger. It became a debate about sovereignty, dignity, and the right of nations to determine their own future. And as tensions rose, one thing became clear. This was no longer simply about security or human rights. It was about who gets to define reality for Africa in the 21st century. The response from Burkina Faso was not delayed, cautious, or diplomatic in the traditional sense. Within hours of the European Parliament's resolution, the government summoned the European Union ambassador and delivered a message that left little room for ambiguity. Officials in Ouagadougou argued that the resolution was based on inaccurate information and failed to reflect the reality on the ground. More importantly, they viewed it as an unacceptable intrusion into the internal affairs of a sovereign nation. During the meeting, Burkina Faso's foreign minister made a point that would become the centerpiece of the country's response. Burkina Faso is not a member of the European Union. Therefore, the European Parliament has neither the authority nor the legitimacy to position itself as a judge over Burkina Faso's domestic policies, security decisions, or management of civic space. The government also challenged the credibility of some of the claims presented before European lawmakers. According to officials, the parliamentarian who introduced the criticism relied on figures and assessments that did not accurately represent the situation in the country. They questioned how such sweeping conclusions could be made about a nation that many of its critics had never personally visited. But the strongest language was reserved for what Burkina Faso described as a lingering neo-colonial attitude. Officials argued that the resolution reflected an outdated belief that African nations must constantly justify themselves before Western institutions. In their view, this approach ignores both national sovereignty and the sacrifices being made by countries fighting terrorism under extremely difficult conditions. The message was clear. Burkina Faso would not accept external actors defining its political reality or dictating its internal choices, whether one agrees with the government's position or not. The response marked a significant moment in the country's foreign policy. It signaled that under Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso intends to confront criticism directly and defend its decisions on the international stage without seeking approval from foreign powers. One of the most controversial aspects of Burkina Faso's response was its decision to bring NATO and Libya back into the conversation. For officials in Ouagadougou, the current security crisis in the Sahel cannot be discussed honestly without examining the events that unfolded more than a decade ago. In 2011, a NATO-led military intervention contributed to the collapse of Libya's government under Muammar Gaddafi. While supporters of the intervention argued that it was necessary to protect civilians, critics have long maintained that the operation created consequences that spread far beyond Libya's borders. According to this view, the fall of the Libyan state triggered the movement of weapons, armed groups, and experienced fighters across vast areas of North and West Africa. The fragile security environment that followed created opportunities for extremist organizations to expand their influence throughout the Sahel region. For Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, this historical context matters. Their leaders argue that today's insecurity did not emerge in isolation. Instead, it developed through a chain of events that involved decisions made by powerful international actors years earlier. This is why Burkina Faso reacted strongly when European lawmakers criticized the country's security situation without acknowledging what officials describe as the deeper roots of the crisis. From their perspective, it is unfair to discuss the consequences while ignoring the causes. Supporters of this argument believe that Western governments should recognize their share of responsibility for the instability that followed the collapse of Libya. Critics, however, counter that, regardless of past mistakes, current governments must still be judged by their ability to protect citizens and restore stability. The debate remains highly contested, but it has become a powerful political tool across the Sahel. By linking today's security challenges to earlier international interventions, Burkina Faso shifts the conversation away from immediate criticism and toward a broader discussion about accountability. As a result, the dispute with the European Parliament is no longer just about terrorism or governance. It has evolved into a debate over history itself, and over who bears responsibility for one of Africa's most persistent security crises. While the dispute between Burkina Faso and the European Parliament may appear to be a diplomatic disagreement, many observers believe a larger transformation is taking place across the Sahel. At the center of that transformation stands the Alliance of Sahel States, commonly known as AES, bringing together Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. What makes this alliance different is that it was not created merely as a security arrangement. It represents a political statement. The three governments have repeatedly declared that they intend to reduce external influence over their domestic and regional affairs while strengthening cooperation among themselves. For decades, regional security strategies in West Africa relied heavily on support from foreign partners, particularly France and other Western countries. However, after years of continuing instability and growing frustration among local populations, leaders in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began pursuing a different path. The creation of AES signaled that shift. The alliance seeks to coordinate military operations, improve border security, and develop common approaches to economic and political challenges. Supporters see it as an effort to create African solutions for African problems. The alliance has also taken symbolic steps that demonstrate its long-term ambitions. These include discussions on common institutions, increased economic coordination, and policies designed to strengthen regional integration outside traditional frameworks. Such moves suggest that AES is not intended to be a temporary response to a crisis, but rather a new geopolitical project. For European policymakers, this development creates new uncertainties. A region that was once strongly influenced by Western partners is increasingly making decisions independently. For the governments involved, however, that independence is precisely the objective. This broader context helps explain why criticism from the European Parliament triggered such a strong reaction in Ouagadougou. Burkina Faso did not view the resolution as an isolated statement. Instead, many officials saw it as part of a larger struggle over who will shape the future of the Sahel. Whether AES ultimately succeeds or fails remains uncertain. What is certain is that it has already changed the political conversation across West Africa and beyond. Beneath the diplomatic language and political arguments lies another issue that many analysts believe is impossible to ignore: resources. The Sahel is not only a region facing security challenges, it is also home to some of Africa's most valuable strategic minerals, resources that have become increasingly important in a rapidly changing global economy. Burkina Faso is one of Africa's major gold producers. Neighboring Niger possesses significant uranium reserves that have long contributed to international energy markets. Mali is emerging as an important player in the lithium sector, a resource essential for batteries, electric vehicles, and future technologies. For supporters of Ibrahim Traore and the broader alliance of Sahel states, these resources are at the heart of the current struggle. They argue that for decades, African nations exported immense wealth while receiving limited benefits in return. As a result, many citizens continue to ask a difficult question: how can countries rich in natural resources remain among the poorest in the world? Traore has built much of his political message around that concern. He frequently emphasizes that national resources should first serve national development. According to this vision, gold, minerals, and other strategic assets must contribute directly to infrastructure, education, healthcare, and economic opportunity for local populations. This message has helped transform Ibrahim Traore into more than a national leader. Across parts of Africa, he has become a symbol of a new generation of leadership focused on sovereignty, self-reliance, and economic independence. His speeches are widely shared on social media, and his image increasingly resonates far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Supporters view him as a leader willing to challenge long-standing power structures. Critics argue that symbolism alone is not enough, and that lasting success must be measured through tangible improvements in security and living standards. Regardless of where one stands, Traore's growing influence helps explain why developments in Burkina Faso attract so much international attention. The debate is no longer only about one government or one country. It has become a discussion about who controls Africa's resources and who ultimately benefits from them. At its core, the dispute between Burkina Faso and the European Parliament reflects a much larger debate that extends far beyond West Africa. It is a debate between two competing visions of governance, legitimacy, and international responsibility. From the perspective of many European policymakers, raising concerns about human rights, democratic standards, and security conditions is both necessary and justified. They argue that governments should be held accountable when freedoms are restricted, humanitarian crises deepen, or instability threatens neighboring countries. In this view, international scrutiny is not interference, but part of a broader commitment to universal values. Burkina Faso sees the issue differently. Officials in Ouagadougou argue that no external institution has the right to dictate how a sovereign nation should manage its internal affairs. They maintain that security challenges, political transitions, and development priorities must be addressed according to national realities rather than foreign expectations. For them, sovereignty is not a symbolic concept. It is the foundation of independence. This difference in perspective explains why the reaction to the European resolution was so strong. The government was not merely responding to criticism, it was defending what it considers a fundamental principle: the right of a nation to choose its own path. The question, therefore, becomes larger than Burkina Faso itself. It touches on an issue increasingly debated across Africa, Asia, and other parts of the developing world. Should international institutions play a greater role in shaping domestic policies, Or should nations retain the final authority over their own future, regardless of outside opinion? There is no simple answer. Yet the growing intensity of this debate suggests that the global balance between sovereignty and international influence is being redefined before our eyes. The confrontation between Burkina Faso and the European Parliament may have started with a single resolution, but it has revealed a much deeper struggle over sovereignty, influence, and the future direction of Africa. For Burkina Faso, the issue is not simply about responding to criticism. It is about defending the principle that every nation has the right to determine its own political, security, and economic path. For the European Union, the debate remains tied to concerns about human rights, democratic governance, and regional stability. Between these two positions lies one of the defining geopolitical discussions of our time: the emergence of the Alliance of Sahel states, the growing emphasis on resource sovereignty, and the rise of leaders such as Captain Ibrahim Traore suggest that a new chapter is unfolding across the continent. Whether these changes ultimately succeed will depend not on rhetoric alone, but on the ability to deliver security, development, and opportunity to ordinary citizens. Perhaps the most important lesson for Africa is that sovereignty must be matched by responsibility, unity, and long-term vision. What do you think? Should international institutions have the authority to publicly judge the internal affairs of sovereign nations? Or should those decisions belong exclusively to the people of each country? If you enjoy discussions about Pan-Africanism, Burkina Faso, Africa New, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the African Union, and the future of Pan-Africanism, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next analysis. Did not come from a coup, a military operation, or a terrorist attack, but from a single sentence spoken by Emmanuel Macron. During the Africa Forward Summit in Kenya, the French president stunned audiences across the continent when he declared that France and its allies were the real Pan-Africanists. Within hours, social media across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger exploded with anger. For many Africans, especially in the Sahel, the statement felt unbelievable. A former colonial power was now claiming ownership of an ideology historically linked to anti-colonial resistance and African liberation. The timing made the controversy even bigger. France was recently pushed out of major parts of the Sahel after years of military presence, rising anti-French protests, and growing support for the Alliance of Sahel states. Now many people believe Paris is trying to return through diplomacy, media influence, cultural partnerships, and a new political narrative designed to repair its image across Africa. Supporters of Macron argue that France has changed and now wants a balanced partnership with African nations. Critics say this is simply old influence wearing a modern face. But one question is now dividing the continent: who truly represents the future of Africa? Is it the traditional Western powers speaking about partnership and democracy, or the new generation of African leaders calling for sovereignty, self-reliance, and complete independence from foreign control? Stay with me until the end, because this story is bigger than France, bigger than Macron, and even bigger than the Sahel itself. It may determine the future direction of Africa for decades to come. And if you enjoy serious discussions about Africa's changing geopolitical future, make sure you subscribe and join this growing community. The controversy surrounding Emmanuel Macron's statement did not begin with a random misunderstanding. It exploded because millions of Africans immediately connected his words to a painful history that still shapes the Sahel today. At the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi, Macron declared that France believed in Africa as one united continent, and then made the statement that shocked many observers. He said France and its partners were the real Pan-Africanists. Almost immediately, reactions spread across social media platforms in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Many users accused the French president of trying to rewrite history at a moment when French influence in the region was collapsing. For many Africans, Pan-Africanism is not simply a political slogan. It is deeply connected to anti-colonial struggle, African sovereignty, and resistance against foreign domination. The ideology is associated with historical figures like Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and many others who challenged Western control over African politics and resources. That is why Macron's statement triggered such emotional reactions. Critics argued that France cannot present itself as the defender of Pan-Africanism, while many people in the Sahel still blame Paris for decades of political interference, military influence, and economic control. The outrage became even stronger because France had recently lost major influence in the region. French troops were expelled from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger after growing anti-French protests and rising nationalist sentiment. Across West Africa, many young Africans now see France as part of the old system they want to escape. Supporters of Macron defended the speech by saying France has changed and now supports African sovereignty and equal partnership. But for many people in the Sahel, the damage was already done. They did not hear a message of partnership. They heard of former colonial power trying to reclaim moral authority over Africa's future. To understand why so many people in the Sahel no longer trust France, we must go back more than a decade. For years, Paris presented itself as a security partner fighting terrorism across West Africa. French troops entered Mali in 2013 under Operation Serval, after armed extremist groups threatened to advance toward the capital. Later, the mission expanded into Operation Barkhane, one of France's largest military operations abroad. French leaders repeatedly said they were protecting regional stability and helping African governments defend their territory. France also argues that its soldiers fought and died alongside African forces and that Paris intervened only after official requests from African governments. But over time, frustration grew across the Sahel. Despite years of military operations, terrorist attacks continued spreading across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Entire villages were displaced. Insecurity worsened in several areas, and many citizens began asking a dangerous political question. If thousands of foreign troops were present for years, why did violence continue expanding? That frustration slowly transformed into anger. Massive anti-French protests erupted in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey. French flags were burned in public demonstrations, while crowds demanded the departure of foreign troops. Social media accelerated the movement, especially among younger Africans who increasingly viewed France as part of the problem, rather than the solution. Critics also accused Paris of maintaining influence through economic systems, military agreements, and political pressure long after formal colonialism had ended. Whether every accusation was true or not became less important than the fact that millions of people believed them. Supporters of France still argue that Paris became an easy scapegoat for deeper regional problems like weak governance, poverty, corruption, and extremist violence, and to some extent, that argument has merit. But politically, perception became reality. Once ordinary citizens stopped believing France was helping the Sahel, the entire relationship began collapsing. And that collapse opened the door for a completely new political movement, now reshaping the future of West Africa. As France was losing influence across the Sahel, a completely different political image began rising across Africa. At the center of that movement stood Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. To millions of young Africans, Traore represents far more than a military leader. He has become a symbol of resistance, sovereignty, and African self-determination. His speeches about economic independence, control of natural resources, and freedom from foreign influence spread rapidly across social media platforms. Many supporters now compare him to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary former president of Burkina Faso, who remains one of the most respected Pan-African figures in modern African history. This is one reason Macron's statement created such a strong emotional reaction. In the eyes of many Africans, Pan-Africanism was built by leaders who fought against foreign domination, not by former colonial powers trying to reinvent themselves as partners of Africa's future. At the same time, the alliance of Sahel states, made up of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, is promoting a new version of Pan-Africanism centered on sovereignty and security. Their message is simple but powerful. African nations must control their own military policies, their own economies, and their own political future without outside interference. That message resonates strongly with younger generations across West Africa. Many feel their countries remained politically independent on paper, while still depending heavily on foreign military support, international financial systems, and external political influence. Supporters of AES believe the region is finally breaking away from that model. Critics warn that replacing one foreign partner with another could create new forms of dependency, especially with growing Russian influence in the region. But emotionally, the movement continues gaining momentum because it speaks directly to pride, frustration, and identity. This is why the battle between Macron's vision and the AES vision matters so much. It is not only about diplomacy or military alliances anymore. It is a struggle over who gets to define what Pan-Africanism truly means in the 21st century. After losing military influence across large parts of the Sahel, France appears to be changing its strategy in Africa. Instead of relying mainly on soldiers and military bases, Paris is now focusing on diplomacy, investment, culture, technology, and media influence. The Africa Forward Summit was designed to present this new image to the continent. Macron repeatedly speaks about a renewed partnership with Africa. He says France no longer wants to dominate African politics, and instead wants balanced cooperation based on mutual respect and sovereignty. French officials now emphasize entrepreneurship, innovation, education, sports, and youth engagement much more than military operations. On the surface, this strategy looks very different from the past. France has reduced or transformed several military bases in Africa. Paris is also increasing investment projects and cultural partnerships in countries like Kenya, Benin, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire. Macron argues that Africa is the youngest and fastest-growing continent in the world, and that France wants to build a modern relationship focused on opportunity rather than control. But many people across the Sahel remain deeply skeptical. For critics, the language may have changed, but the objective remains the same. They believe France is trying to preserve influence through softer methods after losing ground militarily. Instead of direct intervention, they now see media campaigns, diplomatic summits, cultural programs, and economic partnerships becoming the new tools of influence. This explains why Macron's Pan-Africanism statement created such backlash. In the eyes of many Africans, Paris is not simply defending friendship with Africa, it is trying to rebuild legitimacy at a moment when anti-French sentiment is stronger than at any time in recent decades. Supporters of France insist this interpretation is unfair and ignores genuine efforts to reform the relationship. But trust is difficult to rebuild once populations believe they have been controlled for generations. And in today's Africa, perception can be more powerful than official diplomacy. What is happening in the Sahel today is no longer just a regional dispute between France and a few African governments. It has become part of a much larger global struggle over the future of Africa itself. Several major powers are now competing for influence across the continent. France wants to preserve its historical relationships and maintain strategic influence in West Africa. Russia has expanded its security presence by presenting itself as an alternative partner willing to support governments without political pressure. China continues increasing its economic footprint through infrastructure, mining, and development projects. Meanwhile, the United States watches carefully because the Sahel remains strategically important for counterterrorism operations and access to key resources. One of the most sensitive issues is uranium in Niger. For decades, Niger has been an important supplier of uranium used in France's nuclear energy system. That is why political instability and anti-French sentiment in Niger created serious concern in Paris. For many Africans, the uranium issue symbolizes a deeper frustration. They ask why resource-rich nations remain poor, while foreign powers benefit from their natural wealth. At the same time, there is now a massive information war taking place across Africa. Western media often describe AES governments as military regimes aligned with Russia, while many African alternative media platforms portray them as liberation movements fighting neo-colonial influence. Young Africans are increasingly turning away from traditional international media and listening instead to independent online voices. That shift is transforming the political landscape. This is why Macron's statement became so explosive. It entered an environment already filled with distrust, nationalism, geopolitical rivalry, and rising demands for African sovereignty. And so, the battle for Africa today is not only about military power or economic deals. It is about who controls the narrative, who shapes public opinion, and who convinces the next generation that they truly stand with Africa's future. Emmanuel Macron may believe France is entering a new era in Africa. His supporters argue that Paris is finally abandoning the old colonial mindset and trying to build a respectful partnership based on cooperation and development. But across large parts of the Sahel, many people are asking a very different question. If France truly changed, why is distrust toward Paris growing stronger instead of weaker? That question now sits at the center of one of the most important political transformations happening in Africa today. The alliance of Sahel states has become more than a military alliance. For many supporters, it represents a psychological break from decades of dependency and foreign influence. Leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traore have tapped into something powerful across the continent: the desire for dignity, sovereignty, and African self-determination. At the same time, the situation remains complicated. Critics warn that nationalism alone cannot solve insecurity, poverty, unemployment, or economic instability. Others fear that replacing one foreign influence with another could create a new cycle of dependency. The real lesson for African nations is not that one side is perfect and the other side is evil. The real lesson is that Africa must become strong enough to negotiate with every power while remaining controlled by none. Today, the greatest battle is no longer over military bases or political speeches. It is over who gets to shape the future identity of Africa itself. That debate is now shaking the continent from Mali to Burkina Faso, from Niger to the African Union. And whether people support Macron, support AES, or support neither side completely, one thing is certain: the age of passive Africa is ending. A new Pan-African conversation has begun, and figures like Ibrahim Traore are now standing at the center of that Africa new reality. If you enjoyed this discussion, subscribe for more deep analysis on Pan-Africanism, Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traore, and the changing future of Africa. Think about this for a moment. A country had just suffered one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in its recent history. Explosions shook neighborhoods near Bamako. Families were hiding inside their homes. Soldiers were deployed across the capital. And one of Mali's highest-ranking military leaders, Defense Minister General Sadio Camara, was reported dead after a devastating suicide attack. At a moment like this, most world leaders respond with sympathy. They send condolences. They speak carefully because an entire nation is grieving. But Emmanuel Macron chose a different path. Standing before cameras at the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi, the French president publicly suggested that Mali had made the wrong decision by expelling French troops for millions across Africa. The message sounded less like concern and more like mockery delivered during a national tragedy. And suddenly, one uncomfortable question returned to the center of African politics. Has France really abandoned its old colonial mindset? Or has the language changed while the attitude stayed the same? Because this was not just about one sentence from Macron. This was about decades of tension between Paris and its former African colonies. It was about sovereignty, dignity, and the growing belief that Africa no longer wants to be managed from outside powers. In today's video, we break down why Macron's comments triggered outrage across the continent, why the AES nations see this as proof of continued French arrogance, and why this moment may symbolize a much larger shift happening across Africa right now. And if you want deeper analysis on African geopolitics and the future of Pan-African sovereignty, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Mali was already bleeding before the controversy even began. The attack on Mali was not a small security incident. It was the kind of event that leaves an entire nation psychologically wounded. Reports described explosions near Bamako, heavy gunfire, emergency deployments, and terrified civilians trapped inside their homes while uncertainty spread across the capital. For many Malians, the most shocking part was the reported death of Defense Minister General Sadio Camara. Whether every early report was fully confirmed or not, the emotional impact was enormous. Mali was suddenly facing the possibility that even its highest military leadership was no longer safe. A nationwide atmosphere of fear quickly emerged. Curfews were imposed. Security forces flooded strategic areas. The government moved rapidly to stabilize the situation alongside support from AES allies and Russian security partners. But emotionally, the damage had already been done. And then came Emmanuel Macron's speech in Nairobi. Instead of beginning with strong condolences, the French president publicly declared that Mali had probably made the wrong decision when it expelled French troops after the military coups. In simple terms, many Africans heard Macron saying, "You pushed France away. And now, look what happened." That single statement exploded across Pan-African media. Critics argued that Macron sounded less like a sympathetic partner and more like a former colonial power trying to prove that African nations could not survive without French oversight. Across social media, many people accused Paris of turning Mali's tragedy into a political lesson. And the timing made everything worse. Families were still grieving. Mali was still under shock. Yet instead of focusing first on solidarity, the conversation suddenly became about whether Bamako had disobeyed Paris and paid the price for it. For decades, France claimed that its relationship with Africa had changed. Emmanuel Macron himself repeatedly declared that the era of France-Afrique was over. According to Paris, the old system of political control, military pressure, and hidden influence belonged to the past. But many Africans never truly believed that story. The term France-Afrique still carries enormous emotional weight across West Africa because it represents a long history of dependency between France and its former colonies. Even after independence, Paris maintained deep influence through military agreements, economic networks, intelligence cooperation, and political alliances. And nowhere was that influence more visible than in the Sahel. For years, French military bases operated across the region. French troops moved freely through countries that were officially sovereign. At the same time, the CFA franc remained one of the most controversial symbols of continued French influence. Critics argued that true sovereignty could never exist while economic systems still depended heavily on Paris. That is why Macron's comments in Nairobi triggered such a powerful reaction. To many people in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the statement sounded like a reminder that France still believed it had the authority to judge which African governments were making the correct choices. And this is where the real crisis begins for Paris. Because Macron speaks the language of partnership, respect, and mutual development. But every time tensions rise in Africa, many people still feel that France reacts like a power that expects obedience rather than equality. For younger Pan-African movements especially, the problem is no longer just military presence. The problem is the belief that African nations are still treated as political spaces that must remain inside a French sphere of influence. France entered Mali in 2013 under Operation Serval with massive international support. At the time, jihadist groups were advancing rapidly across northern Mali, and many people genuinely saw French troops as a force that could prevent the collapse of the country. Initially, the operation was praised. French forces pushed extremist groups back and helped stabilize key areas. But what was supposed to be a short intervention slowly transformed into something much larger. Operation Barkhane expanded across the Sahel with thousands of French troops deployed in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mauritania. And yet, despite nearly a decade of military operations, terrorism continued to spread. Entire regions became more unstable. Civilian deaths increased. Armed groups expanded beyond Mali into neighboring countries. According to international security reports, the Sahel eventually became one of the deadliest terrorism zones in the world. That reality created a dangerous question for Paris. If France had been fighting terrorism for almost 10 years, why did the crisis continue getting worse? Supporters of France argue that the situation would have collapsed completely without French intervention. They say the Sahel governments were weak, underfunded, and facing impossible security challenges. But critics inside Africa ask a different question. Was France truly solving the problem, or simply managing instability while maintaining strategic influence in the region? This is exactly why many people in Mali lost trust in the French presence. From their perspective, years of foreign military operations brought enormous promises but very limited long-term security. Western analysts often respond by pointing out that Mali still faces violence even after French troops left. And that is true. The security crisis did not disappear overnight. But supporters of AES answer with one powerful argument. If the old model was truly successful, then why did so many African nations eventually decide to reject it? The rise of AES changed the political atmosphere across West Africa. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were no longer presenting themselves as isolated military governments. They were presenting themselves as the beginning of a new sovereignty movement inside Africa. And no figure symbolizes that shift more than Captain Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso. Across social media and Pan-African circles, Traore has become far more than a national leader. Supporters describe him as the face of a new African generation that refuses to accept foreign control over security, resources, or political decisions. His speeches about dignity, independence, and economic sovereignty resonate strongly with younger Africans who believe their countries remained politically independent, but economically trapped. Assimi Goïta in Mali follows a similar path. Both leaders consistently argue that African nations must choose their own partners without pressure from Paris, Washington, or Brussels. That is why Mali's growing relationship with Russia became so symbolic. For AES supporters, cooperation with Moscow is not simply about military support. It represents the rejection of a world where France automatically decides who Africa should trust. Of course, critics quickly point out that Russia is not a perfect alternative. Some analysts warn that replacing one foreign influence with another may create new forms of dependency in the future. But many supporters of AES answer that argument with a simple response. At least this time, the choice belongs to Africans themselves, and that may be the most important change happening in the Sahel today. The debate is no longer only about terrorism or military alliances. It is about who has the right to define Africa's future for millions across the continent. AES represents something larger than politics. It represents the possibility that African nations can finally speak with their own voice, make their own mistakes, and defend their own sovereignty without asking permission from former colonial powers. What truly worries many Western governments is not simply the existence of military regimes in the Sahel. Africa has experienced coups before. The deeper concern is that a growing number of African nations are beginning to openly challenge the old geopolitical order that dominated the continent for decades. For years, Western powers presented themselves as Africa's primary security and development partners. But now, many countries are asking uncomfortable questions about dependency, sovereignty, and who truly benefits from these relationships. That is why the conflict between France and AES has become much bigger than Mali alone. Western critics argue that nationalism and anti-French rhetoric cannot solve terrorism, poverty, or weak institutions. They warn that emotional speeches about sovereignty are meaningless unless governments also improve security, education, healthcare, and economic stability. And to some extent, those criticisms are valid. Real sovereignty requires more than military independence. It requires functioning institutions, stable economies, and long-term development. Otherwise, political liberation can easily become another cycle of instability. But supporters of AES believe something equally important. They believe that no country can build true stability while remaining psychologically dependent on outside powers. In their eyes, sovereignty may be difficult, risky, and expensive, but dependency is far more dangerous in the long run. That is the lesson many Africans are now debating, not whether France is entirely good or entirely bad, not whether Russia is a perfect alternative, but whether African nations finally have the courage to choose their own direction, even if the road ahead is uncertain. And perhaps that is the biggest shift happening in Africa today. For the first time in decades, many countries are no longer asking how to be protected. They are asking how to be respected. So in the end, the controversy surrounding Emmanuel Macron was never only about one speech in Nairobi. It became symbolic of something much deeper happening across Africa today. When Mali was mourning its dead, many Africans expected compassion from France. Instead, they heard a message that sounded like a warning that nations which reject French influence may suffer the consequences, whether Macron intended it that way or not. That is how millions of people across the continent interpreted his words, and that is why the reaction became so emotional. Because this debate is no longer only about counter-terrorism operations or military alliances, it is about memory. It is about dignity. It is about whether African nations truly have the right to choose their own future without being judged by former colonial powers. The countries of AES understand that sovereignty comes with risks. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger know the road ahead will not be easy. Terrorism remains dangerous. Economic pressure remains real. international criticism continues to grow. But for supporters of Pan-African movements, something historic is happening. A new generation of African leaders is openly declaring that dependence can no longer be the foundation of Africa's future. Figures like Captain Ibrahim Traore and Assimi Goïta have become symbols of a larger movement connected to Pan-Africanism, the African Union, and the growing demand for an Africa new vision built on sovereignty and self-respect. Whether people agree with them or not, one fact is becoming impossible to ignore. Africa is changing, and perhaps the biggest mistake France can make is believing that the old relationship can still survive under a different name. If this video resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Do you believe Macron was simply being honest? Or did his comments reveal the true face of French policy in Africa? Subscribe for more deep analysis on Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traore, Pan-African geopolitics, and the future of African sovereignty. Look at the map of West Africa today. Look closely at Mali. Look at Burkina Faso. Look at Niger. Across the Sahel, something extraordinary is happening. Nations that once depended heavily on foreign military partnerships are now attempting to build their own path. They are closing doors that remained open for decades. They are speaking the language of sovereignty, self-reliance, and national control. Then suddenly, another headline appears. While the alliance of Sahel states continues moving toward greater independence, Ghana has signed a historic security and defense partnership with the European Union and accepted a package worth 50 million euros, approximately $54 million. The package includes surveillance drones, anti-drone technology, intelligence systems, communications equipment, and border security support. For some observers, this is a smart and practical decision designed to strengthen Ghana's security. For others, it raises uncomfortable questions about whether Europe is finding a new foothold in West Africa after losing influence in the Sahel. So what is really happening? Is this a security partnership that will make Ghana stronger, or is it the beginning of a new geopolitical struggle that could reshape the future of West Africa? Today, we will examine the details of the 50 million euro agreement, explore why the European Union suddenly considers Ghana so important, and ask whether this deal represents protection, partnership, or something much bigger. And if you appreciate honest discussions about Africa's changing political landscape, make sure you follow the channel because the story unfolding today may influence the future of the entire region. The agreement itself immediately attracted attention across Africa. Ghana became the first African nation to establish this type of formal security and defense partnership with the European Union. The support package includes advanced surveillance drones, anti-drone systems, intelligence equipment, electronic warfare capabilities, communication technology, and resources for security forces operating near the northern border. On paper, it looks like a major investment in Ghana's safety, but across West Africa, many people were not simply looking at the equipment. They were looking at the timing. And that timing is what transformed a security agreement into one of the most debated geopolitical developments in the region. The question many Africans are asking today is simple. Why is Europe suddenly so interested in Ghana? To answer that question, we have to look beyond Accra and examine what has happened across the Sahel over the past few years. For decades, Western governments maintained significant security influence in countries such as Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Military missions, training programs, intelligence cooperation, and foreign bases became major features of the regional security landscape. The stated objective was clear: fight terrorism, strengthen stability, and support local governments. But something changed. Military transitions took place in all three countries. New leaders emerged. Public frustration grew. Many citizens began questioning whether years of foreign involvement had actually improved security conditions. Instead of seeing progress, many communities continued to face violence, instability, and displacement. As political attitudes shifted, the relationship between the Sahel states and Western powers began to deteriorate. Foreign military forces were asked to leave. Long-standing partnerships weakened. Western influence across the region declined dramatically. This is where Ghana enters the story. Unlike the alliance of Sahel states, Ghana has remained politically stable and continues to maintain strong relationships with international partners. Geographically, it occupies a strategic position along the Gulf of Guinea while sharing regional security concerns connected to instability further north. From a European perspective, Ghana offers something valuable. It is stable, cooperative, and strategically located. Supporters of the new partnership argue that this is simply common sense. If security threats are moving southward, then cooperation should also move southward. They see the agreement as preventive action designed to stop instability before it reaches Ghanaian communities. Critics see a different picture. They argue that after losing influence in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, Europe needed a new partner capable of maintaining visibility in the region. In their view, Ghana is not merely receiving assistance. It is becoming an important strategic platform in a changing geopolitical landscape. Whether one agrees with that interpretation or not, one fact remains impossible to ignore. The timing of this partnership has transformed a security agreement into a much larger debate about influence, sovereignty, and the future direction of West Africa. At the center of this controversy is a question that neither supporters nor critics can completely ignore. Does Ghana genuinely need this partnership? The answer is more complicated than many people are willing to admit. Unlike some of the emotional debates taking place online, Ghana faces real security concerns. The northern regions of the country sit close to areas affected by instability in the Sahel. Security experts have repeatedly warned that violent extremist groups operating in neighboring regions could attempt to expand their influence further south. From the perspective of Ghanaian policymakers, preparing for future threats is not optional. It is a responsibility. This is exactly why officials in Accra welcomed the new partnership. Advanced surveillance drones can improve border monitoring. Anti-drone systems can help defend sensitive infrastructure. Intelligence equipment can strengthen early warning capabilities. Communication systems can improve coordination among security forces. Viewed through this lens, the agreement appears practical rather than political. The European Union presents a similar argument. European leaders argue that security challenges no longer stop at national borders. Terrorism, organized crime, cyber threats, and illegal trafficking affect multiple regions simultaneously. According to this view, supporting Ghana contributes to stability across both West Africa and Europe. Yet critics remain skeptical. They point out that security partnerships often involve more than equipment. Modern intelligence systems collect information, surveillance systems generate data, communication networks create access points. The key question becomes who ultimately controls those capabilities. If the technology comes from abroad, who manages upgrades? Who controls technical support? Who has access to sensitive information? Who determines long-term operational standards? These questions do not automatically mean the partnership is harmful, but they explain why many Africans are debating the issue so intensely. The real discussion is no longer about drones or equipment. It is about strategic independence. Can a nation strengthen its security through foreign cooperation while still maintaining complete control over its own future? That question may ultimately determine how history judges Ghana's decision. The debate surrounding Ghana's agreement with the European Union becomes even more interesting when we compare it with the path chosen by the alliance of Sahel states. Today, West Africa appears to be developing two very different visions for its future security architecture. The first vision is represented by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Rather than relying heavily on external military partnerships, these countries are attempting to build collective security through regional cooperation. The Alliance of Sahel States was created with the goal of strengthening military coordination, intelligence sharing, and joint operations among its members. Their leaders argue that African nations must become the primary defenders of African security. Supporters of this approach believe genuine sovereignty requires control over military planning, intelligence gathering, and strategic decision-making. They argue that dependence on foreign security structures can create vulnerabilities that eventually limit national freedom of action. The second vision is represented by Ghana's recent partnership with the European Union. Instead of reducing international cooperation, Ghana has chosen to deepen it. Supporters believe modern security threats are too complex for any country to face alone. Access to advanced technology, training, intelligence support, and financial resources can strengthen national defenses and help prevent future crises. Neither model is entirely without merit. The AES approach offers greater strategic independence, but also requires significant financial resources, military capacity, and long-term political commitment. Building self-sufficient security institutions is a difficult process that may take many years. The Ghana approach provides immediate access to valuable capabilities and expertise. However, critics worry that long-term reliance on external partners could gradually weaken strategic autonomy. This is why the current debate extends far beyond Ghana itself. West Africa is becoming a testing ground for two competing philosophies. One prioritizes self-reliance even when the road is difficult. The other prioritizes partnership even if it raises concerns about dependence. The outcome of this debate may influence how future generations of African leaders define security, sovereignty, and national development throughout the continent. To fully understand why this agreement generated such strong reactions, we must look at the leaders who have come to symbolize the movement for greater sovereignty in the Sahel. No figure has captured more attention in recent years than Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. To his supporters, Traore represents a new generation of African leadership. His message consistently focuses on self-reliance, national dignity, and reducing dependence on external powers. Whether people agree with him or not, his popularity has transformed him into one of the most influential political voices in contemporary African debates. From the perspective of many Traore supporters, the critical issue is not the 50 million euros. The real issue is control. Who owns the technology? Who controls the data? Who determines how security systems operate in the future? Those questions often matter more than the value of the equipment itself. Similar ideas can be found in the approaches of Mali's Assimi Goïta and Niger's Abdourahmane Chiani. Both leaders have promoted the argument that national security must remain under national command. They believe foreign partnerships should support local institutions rather than become the foundation upon which security depends. This explains why many supporters of the Alliance of Sahel States reacted strongly to Ghana's decision. To them, the agreement appears to move in the opposite direction from the path currently being pursued by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. While the AES seeks greater control over its security systems, Ghana has chosen deeper engagement with an external partner. Of course, supporters of Ghana's position would argue that sovereignty and cooperation are not mutually exclusive. A country can work with international partners while still protecting its national interests. Yet the disagreement remains significant because it reflects two very different visions of Africa's future. One vision seeks maximum autonomy, The other seeks strategic partnerships. The debate surrounding Ghana's agreement is ultimately a debate about which vision will shape the next chapter of West African history. The controversy surrounding the alliance of Sahel states does not end within Africa. It has also generated strong reactions from Western governments, policy experts, and international organizations. Critics of the AES argue that the alliance risks isolating itself from valuable international partnerships. They claim that reducing cooperation with traditional security partners could weaken counterterrorism efforts, limit access to resources, and create new economic challenges. According to this perspective, modern security threats are global in nature. No nation can address them entirely alone. International cooperation is viewed not as a weakness but as a necessity. Supporters of the AES offer a different response. They point to decades of foreign military involvement across parts of the Sahel and ask a simple question: if the previous model was successful, why did insecurity continue to spread? Many supporters argue that the issue is not cooperation itself. The issue is dependence. They believe African nations should be able to choose partnerships from a position of strength rather than necessity. This distinction is important. The debate is not between isolation and cooperation, it is between partnership and reliance. For Ghana, and for other African countries, the lesson may be straightforward. International support can provide valuable tools, training, and resources. However, long-term security remains strongest when local institutions maintain control over strategy, decision-making, and national priorities. As West Africa continues to evolve, every country will face the same challenge. How do you benefit from global partnerships without surrendering strategic independence? That question may become one of the defining issues of Africa's future. As we reach the end of this discussion, one thing becomes clear: the debate surrounding Ghana's €50 million agreement with the European Union is about far more than money, drones, or security equipment. At its core, this is a debate about the future direction of West Africa. On one side, Ghana has chosen a path that embraces international cooperation, advanced technology, and strategic partnerships. Supporters believe this approach can strengthen national security and help the country prepare for threats that continue to emerge across the region. On the other side, the alliance of Sahel states is pursuing a different vision. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are attempting to build greater self-reliance, greater control over security policy, and greater independence from external influence. Their leaders argue that true sovereignty requires national command over the institutions responsible for protecting the nation. Neither path is without risks. Partnership can bring resources, expertise, and immediate capabilities. But dependence can become a burden if control slowly shifts away from national institutions. Autonomy can strengthen sovereignty and national confidence. But self-reliance also demands patience, sacrifice, and the ability to overcome difficult challenges without outside assistance. That is why the real question is not whether Ghana should accept €50 million. The real question is whether Ghana can accept assistance while maintaining complete control over its strategic future. The answer to that question will not only affect Ghana, it may influence the future of Pan-African thought, the evolution of the African Union, and the broader conversation surrounding Pan-Africanism throughout the continent. As nations such as Burkina Faso continue to promote a new vision of sovereignty under leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traore, and as voices supporting Africa, new political thinking continue to grow, the choices made today will shape the continent for decades to come. Whether one agrees with Ibrahim Traore and the alliance of Sahel states or supports Ghana's approach, every African nation faces the same challenge: How do you engage the world without losing control of your own destiny? Thank you for watching. If you enjoy serious discussions about African geopolitics, strategic independence, and the future of the continent, please subscribe to the channel and join us for the next conversation.
The message came from Ouagadougou, but its echo traveled far beyond Burkina Faso. Independence always comes with a price. With those words, Iran's ambassador to Burkina Faso sent a direct signal not only to Africa, but also to Washington, Paris, and every global power watching the Sahel region with growing concern. At a time when Iran faces sanctions, military pressure, and diplomatic isolation, and Burkina Faso continues to battle insecurity and economic hardship, the two nations are openly moving closer together instead of stepping back. For many observers, this partnership looks surprising. One country has spent decades resisting Western pressure in the Middle East. The other is a poor African nation struggling against terrorism and political instability. Yet both governments now speak the same language of sovereignty, resistance, and national dignity. Iran believes Burkina Faso and the alliance of Sahel states represent something larger than a temporary political movement. Tehran sees a new generation of African leaders refusing to accept the old balance of power. And at the center of that transformation stands Captain Ibrahim Traore. To supporters, he represents courage and African self-respect. To critics, he represents dangerous nationalism and military rule. But whether admired or feared, his influence is spreading far beyond Burkina Faso. If you want to understand the silent geopolitical revolution reshaping Africa today, make sure to subscribe and stay with us until the end. Iran has lived under sanctions and international pressure for decades. Its economy has suffered, its banking system has been restricted, and its leaders have repeatedly faced threats from Western powers. Yet despite all of that pressure, Tehran has never accepted the idea of surrendering its political independence. That long experience is one reason why Iran now sees something familiar in the governments of the Sahel. For Iranian officials, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not simply military governments trying to survive temporary crises. They are part of a larger movement challenging the old geopolitical order in Africa. When Iran's ambassador declared that independence always comes with a price, he was speaking from the perspective of a country that believes survival under pressure is itself a form of victory. This explains why Tehran continues strengthening ties with Burkina Faso, even while facing serious tensions in the Middle East. Iran sees strategic value in building alliances with countries that reject outside control and seek alternative partnerships beyond Western influence. Instead of offering aid with political conditions attached, Tehran presents itself as a partner that understands isolation, sanctions, and resistance. At the same time, Burkina Faso also benefits from this relationship. The government of Captain Ibrahim Traore wants to show the world that it is not alone, despite growing criticism from Western nations. By standing publicly beside Iran, Burkina Faso sends a message that it is willing to explore a new diplomatic path built around sovereignty and national dignity rather than dependency. For supporters of this alliance, the message is simple. Poor nations may lack money and military power, but they do not have to abandon their pride or their right to choose their own future. Across Africa, Ibrahim Traore is no longer viewed as only the leader of Burkina Faso. He is becoming a symbol of something much larger. To many young Africans, he represents a new generation that is tired of dependency, foreign influence, and political systems that fail to improve everyday life. The comparisons with Thomas Sankara are impossible to ignore. Like Sankara decades earlier, Traore presents himself as a leader focused on sovereignty, national dignity, and control over natural resources. He often appears in military uniform instead of expensive Western-style suits, and his speeches speak directly about pride, sacrifice, and self-determination. For supporters, this simplicity makes him appear closer to ordinary people than many traditional politicians. His rise also reflects deep frustration across the Sahel. Countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger remain rich in gold, uranium, and other valuable resources. Yet millions of people still live in poverty while insecurity continues to spread. Many citizens have started asking difficult questions. If foreign partnerships and military missions lasted for years, why did violence continue to grow? Why do resource-rich nations remain economically weak? Traore's message speaks directly to those frustrations. He argues that African nations must stop depending entirely on outside powers and start controlling their own future. That message is spreading far beyond Burkina Faso because many Africans see their own struggles reflected in his words. Still, critics warn that revolutionary language alone cannot solve economic problems or defeat terrorism. History shows that nationalism can inspire hope, but it can also create dangerous expectations if real improvements do not follow. Yet for now, Ibrahim Traore remains one of the most influential and controversial political figures emerging from modern Africa. The struggle over the Sahel is no longer only about terrorism or political instability. It is increasingly becoming a battle over resources, influence, and the future direction of Africa itself. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger may be among the poorest countries in the world, but together they possess enormous strategic importance because of their gold, uranium, and other natural resources. This is one reason the Alliance of Sahel States, known as AES, matters far beyond West Africa. Originally created as a security partnership between military governments facing extremist violence, the alliance is now evolving into something much larger. Its leaders openly speak about sovereignty, economic independence, and reducing dependence on former colonial powers. For decades, Western nations maintained strong influence across the Sahel through military cooperation, economic agreements, and political partnerships. But many citizens began losing confidence after years of insecurity, poverty, and failed promises. That frustration created an opening for new international players. Russia expanded its security presence in the region, while Iran started presenting itself as a partner that understands resistance against external pressure. Both countries offer an alternative narrative to the Western model. Instead of speaking mainly about democracy and political reforms, they focus on sovereignty, self-defense, and strategic independence. This growing geopolitical competition worries many Western governments because the Sahel contains some of Africa's most valuable strategic resources. Losing influence there could weaken both economic and political interests that have existed for generations. The message now coming from the Sahel is powerful and deeply symbolic. These nations may struggle financially, but they are increasingly determined to control their own resources, alliances, and political future. As Iran and the Alliance of Sahel States grow closer, Western governments and media organizations are watching with increasing concern. For many officials in Europe and the United States, the rise of military-led governments in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger represents a dangerous shift away from democratic systems and traditional international partnerships. Western critics argue that alliances with countries like Iran and Russia could deepen instability in the region. They warn that military governments often centralize power, weaken political opposition, and reduce democratic freedoms. Some analysts also fear that anti-Western rhetoric is being used to strengthen political control while avoiding accountability for economic hardship and security failures. Those concerns are not entirely without merit. Burkina Faso still faces serious terrorist threats, economic difficulties, and humanitarian challenges. Large parts of the population continue to struggle with poverty and insecurity despite the promises of political change. Critics ask whether revolutionary speeches about sovereignty can truly improve daily life for ordinary citizens. Yet supporters of the AES respond with a difficult question of their own. After decades of Western influence, military cooperation, and international intervention, why does the Sahel remain trapped in violence and underdevelopment? For many citizens, the old system failed to provide security, prosperity, or dignity. That frustration created fertile ground for leaders like Ibrahim Traore. The deeper problem may not simply be geopolitics. It may be a crisis of trust. Many Africans no longer want outside powers making decisions about their resources, security, and political future. They are not necessarily rejecting cooperation with the West. Instead, they are demanding relationships based more on equality and respect. This is why the message coming from Burkina Faso resonates across parts of Africa. Independence may indeed come with painful costs, but many people have started believing that dependence can cost even more. For all the powerful speeches about sovereignty and resistance, the reality facing Burkina Faso remains extremely difficult. Independence may inspire national pride, but it does not automatically solve economic hardship, insecurity, or political instability. In fact, breaking away from powerful international partners can sometimes create even greater pressure on fragile countries. Burkina Faso continues to face deadly extremist violence across large parts of the country. Thousands of families have been displaced, businesses struggle to operate, and economic growth remains fragile. At the same time, tensions with Western governments risk reducing foreign investment and international financial support. This is the difficult price many nations encounter when trying to redefine their place in the global system. There is also another danger that many supporters of sovereignty rarely discuss openly. Rejecting dependence on one group of foreign powers does not automatically guarantee true independence. Some critics warn that countries like Burkina Faso could eventually become too dependent on new partners such as Russia or Iran for security, weapons, or political backing. That is why real sovereignty requires much more than emotional speeches or symbolic alliances. A truly independent nation needs strong institutions, stable education systems, productive industries, and the ability to protect its own people without relying entirely on outside assistance. History offers many examples of revolutionary movements that inspired enormous hope but later struggled to deliver practical results. National pride can unite people during moments of crisis. But over time, citizens judge governments based on daily realities such as safety, jobs, healthcare, and food prices. This may be the greatest challenge facing Captain Ibrahim Traore and the alliance of Sahel states. They are not only trying to resist outside pressure, they are trying to prove that sovereignty can improve the lives of ordinary people instead of becoming only a powerful political slogan. Whether the alliance of Sahel states ultimately succeeds or fails, one thing is already clear. A new political mood is spreading across parts of Africa. It is driven by frustration, pride, and the belief that African nations should have greater control over their own resources, security, and future. For many supporters of this movement, Captain Ibrahim Traore represents more than a national leader. He represents a new generation willing to challenge systems that many Africans believe kept the continent dependent for too long. His speeches about sovereignty and dignity resonate because they connect with emotions that exist far beyond Burkina Faso. At the same time, the future remains uncertain. Pan-Africanism has returned as a powerful idea, but ideas alone cannot transform nations. The alliance of Sahel states must still prove that political independence can bring real stability, economic opportunity, and security for ordinary people. If conditions do not improve, public enthusiasm could eventually fade. Still, the geopolitical significance of this moment cannot be ignored. Iran's support for Burkina Faso shows how global alliances are changing in an increasingly multipolar world. Old powers are losing influence in some regions while new partnerships continue to emerge. The debate is no longer only about East versus West. It is increasingly about whether nations can defend their sovereignty without becoming dependent on another block of power. Across Africa, many people are watching Burkina Faso closely. Some see hope, others see danger, but almost everyone recognizes that a major shift is taking place. The future of Africa. New political movements may depend on whether leaders like Ibrahim Traore can transform revolutionary language into practical results. The African Union, supporters of Pan-African ideals, and advocates of Pan-Africanism all understand that the stakes are enormous. Burkina Faso has become one of the central symbols of this historic debate. If you believe Africa is entering a historic turning point, subscribe to the channel and join us for more deep stories shaping the future of the continent.
For years, many observers believed the alliance of Sahel states would struggle to survive. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger chose a different path, critics predicted isolation, economic hardship, and political instability. Yet in 2026, the conversation looks very different. Instead of asking whether AES can survive, many people are asking why neighboring countries suddenly seem interested in working with it. One recent development has attracted particular attention. Ivory Coast has expressed its willingness to resume security cooperation with Mali and Burkina Faso. On the surface, that may sound like a positive step toward regional stability. However, one question immediately emerged. Why was this message delivered in Paris rather than Bamako or Ouagadougou? That question has become the center of a growing debate across West Africa. Is this a genuine effort to rebuild trust between African neighbors? Or does it represent something much larger? In this video, we will explore the changing political landscape behind this unexpected proposal and what it may mean for the future of the Sahel. If you are interested in Africa's future and the major geopolitical changes unfolding across the continent, consider subscribing and joining this conversation. To understand why this proposal surprised so many people, we must look back at recent history. Relations between Ivory Coast and the countries that now form AES have been tense for several years. Political disagreements, security concerns, and diplomatic disputes created significant mistrust between the two sides. One of the most notable incidents was the detention of 49 Ivorian soldiers in Mali, a case that generated a major diplomatic crisis. At the same time, many supporters of AES viewed President Alassane Ouattara's government as closely aligned with policies that placed pressure on Mali and Burkina Faso. For that reason, the latest proposal appears unexpected. The real question is not why tensions existed. The real question is, what has changed enough to make cooperation possible again? The announcement from Ivory Coast was not controversial because of what was said. It became controversial because of where it was said. The proposal was presented during Eurosatory, one of the world's largest defense exhibitions, held in Paris. For some observers, that detail may seem insignificant. For many people across the Sahel, however, it carries powerful political symbolism. There are several ways to interpret this decision. The most optimistic interpretation is that Paris was simply the location of an international event where senior officials happened to be present. From this perspective, the statement represented a practical diplomatic opportunity rather than a calculated political message. A second interpretation suggests that the proposal was designed as a test. Before sending high-level delegations to Bamako or Ouagadougou, Ivory Coast may have wanted to gauge reactions from AES leaders and the broader public. In international politics, governments often release trial messages before committing themselves to formal negotiations. A third interpretation is far more controversial. Many supporters of AES argue that the choice of Paris cannot be separated from the historical role France has played in West Africa. For decades, major security and political decisions affecting the region were often discussed through channels connected to Paris. Because of that history, some people view the announcement as more than a diplomatic gesture. They see it as a symbolic reminder of older influence networks that AES has spent years trying to distance itself from. This is why the location matters. Imagine two neighbors attempting to repair a damaged relationship. One approach would be to sit down face-to-face and speak directly. Another would be to make the offer through a third party. Both methods may lead to the same result, but they create very different perceptions. Whether the message reflects genuine reconciliation or a cautious diplomatic experiment remains unclear. What is clear is that the decision to announce it in Paris ensured that the debate would extend far beyond the words themselves. What makes this moment particularly remarkable is that only a few years ago, many analysts predicted that the alliance of Sahel states would fail. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger chose to pursue a different political path, they faced diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and widespread skepticism from both regional and international observers. At that time, the dominant narrative suggested that the three countries would become increasingly isolated. Critics argued that they lacked the resources, partnerships, and institutional support needed to sustain their vision. Yet the reality that emerged has been very different. Rather than collapsing, AES has strengthened cooperation among its members. The alliance has developed joint security mechanisms, increased military coordination, and worked to build a common strategic direction. While significant challenges remain, the organization has demonstrated a level of resilience that many observers did not expect. This shift has changed how neighboring countries view the alliance. In politics, perception often follows reality. When a political project appears weak, few governments want to associate themselves with it. When that same project demonstrates endurance and influence, attitudes begin to change. The contrast between 2022 and 2026 is striking. Several years ago, discussions focused on whether AES could survive. Today, conversations increasingly focus on how other countries should engage with it. That transformation alone represents a significant geopolitical development. The growing interest from neighboring states may therefore reflect a broader recognition that AES has become an important actor in West Africa. Whether governments fully agree with its policies or not, they can no longer ignore its presence. This may be the deeper story behind Ivory Coast's proposal. The question is not simply why Ivory Coast wants to cooperate. The more important question may be why cooperation now appears necessary. As the regional balance of power evolves, countries throughout West Africa are adjusting to a new reality. AES is no longer viewed merely as a political experiment. It is increasingly being treated as a permanent part of the region's future. At the center of this discussion stands one of the most influential figures in contemporary African politics, Captain Ibrahim Traore. Although the proposal came from Ivory Coast, many people immediately began asking a different question. How would Ibrahim Traore respond? The reason is simple. For many supporters across Africa, Traore represents more than the leadership of Burkina Faso. He has become a symbol of sovereignty, self-determination, and the belief that African nations should have greater control over their political and economic futures. This perspective is important because it helps explain why the debate is not really about whether AES should talk to Ivory Coast. The debate is about the conditions under which such dialogue should take place. One common misunderstanding is the belief that independence requires isolation. In reality, these are two very different ideas. A country can defend its sovereignty while still maintaining diplomatic and economic relations with its neighbors. The key question is whether those relationships are based on equality and mutual respect. From that perspective, cooperation with Ivory Coast would not automatically contradict the principles often associated with Ibrahim Traore. What matters is the framework in which that cooperation occurs. If both sides engage as equal partners pursuing shared interests, dialogue becomes possible. If outside actors are perceived as shaping the process, skepticism naturally increases. This is where the choice of Paris becomes particularly significant. For many people in the Sahel, Paris is not merely a city. It represents a historical system of influence that AES has repeatedly challenged. As a result, some observers are less concerned about the content of the proposal than about the political symbolism surrounding it. Ultimately, the question facing AES may not be whether to engage with Ivory Coast. The more important question may be whether the proposal reflects a genuine African-to-African partnership. If it does, dialogue could strengthen regional stability. If doubts remain about who is truly driving the initiative, caution will likely continue to shape the response from leaders such as Ibrahim Traore. Every major diplomatic opportunity comes with both benefits and risks. and the proposal from Ivory Coast is no exception. For AES leaders, the challenge is not simply deciding whether to cooperate. The challenge is determining whether the potential advantages outweigh the possible dangers. On the positive side, improved cooperation could strengthen border security. The frontiers connecting Mali, Burkina Faso, and Ivory Coast have long been vulnerable to the movement of armed groups, illegal trafficking networks, and other security threats. Better communication and coordination could help address some of these challenges more effectively. Economic considerations also matter. Ivory Coast possesses one of the most important commercial gateways in West Africa through the port of Abidjan. Stronger relations could improve trade routes, reduce transportation difficulties, and create new opportunities for economic growth across the region. However, supporters of AES often focus on a different issue: trust. Years of political disagreements and diplomatic confrontations have left deep scars. For many people in the Sahel, trust cannot be restored through a single statement delivered at an international conference. There are also concerns about influence. Because Ivory Coast maintains close relations with Western partners, some observers worry that cooperation could create channels through which external interests might regain leverage within the region. Whether these concerns are justified or not, they remain an important part of the public debate. For this reason, many analysts believe AES is unlikely to embrace the proposal without conditions. A gradual approach may be more realistic. Limited cooperation in areas such as border security, intelligence sharing, and regional stability could serve as a test of intentions before deeper partnerships are considered. The central issue is therefore not whether cooperation is possible. The central issue is whether confidence can be rebuilt slowly enough to protect sovereignty while creating practical benefits for all sides involved. The rise of AES has generated strong reactions both inside and outside Africa. Supporters see the alliance as evidence that African countries can pursue independent policies while protecting their national interests. Critics, however, often view the situation very differently. One of the most common criticisms is that AES risks isolating itself from the international community. According to this argument, distancing from traditional partners could reduce economic opportunities and weaken regional cooperation. Yet, supporters of AES respond that independence does not mean isolation. They argue that countries have the right to choose their partnerships based on national interests rather than historical expectations. Another criticism is that AES may be creating divisions within West Africa. Critics suggest that alternative regional structures could undermine existing institutions. In response, many supporters argue that lasting cooperation can only succeed when member states feel their sovereignty and interests are respected. From this perspective, reform and new approaches are not necessarily signs of division, but attempts to create a more balanced relationship among nations. These debates contain important lessons for the rest of Africa. The first lesson is that sovereignty remains a powerful issue across the continent. Many African societies continue to ask how their resources, security policies, and economic decisions should be managed. The second lesson is that self-reliance and international cooperation do not have to be opposites. Countries can engage with global partners while maintaining control over their own priorities. Perhaps the most important lesson is that influence is earned through resilience. AES gained greater attention not because others suddenly changed their opinions, but because the alliance continued to exist and adapt despite significant pressure. Whether one agrees with AES or not, its experience has become part of a larger conversation about Africa's future. That conversation is increasingly focused on how African nations can build partnerships that reflect their own interests, aspirations, and long-term goals. The proposal from Ivory Coast is about more than diplomacy. It is about how power, influence, and trust are being reshaped across West Africa. Only a few years ago, many observers believed that AES would struggle to survive. Today, the discussion has shifted dramatically. Instead of asking whether AES will endure, people are asking how neighboring countries should engage with it. The controversy surrounding the announcement in Paris highlights a deeper issue. For many people across the Sahel, location matters because symbols matter. A message delivered in Bamako or Ouagadougou would have carried a very different meaning than one delivered in a European capital with a long history of involvement in African affairs. At the same time, diplomacy often requires pragmatism. Refusing every opportunity for dialogue can create unnecessary barriers, while accepting every proposal without caution can expose a country to new risks. The challenge facing AES is therefore finding the right balance between openness and vigilance. What happens next will depend less on speeches and more on actions. If Ivory Coast wishes to rebuild trust, concrete steps will speak louder than diplomatic statements. Trust is not created through announcements. It is built through consistent behavior over time. Perhaps the most important lesson is that Africa's political landscape is changing. The growing influence of AES reflects broader debates about sovereignty, development, and self-determination. Whether one fully supports the alliance or not, it has become an important part of the continent's future conversation. As this story continues to unfold, many people will be watching closely to see whether cooperation develops or caution prevails. One thing is certain: discussions about Pan-African unity, Burkina Faso, Africa New Leadership, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the African Union, Pan-Africanism, and the vision promoted by Ibrahim Traore will remain at the center of debates about the future direction of the continent. If you believe Africa's future should be shaped by Africans themselves, be sure to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and join us for the next discussion. West Africa is shaking under the weight of terrorism, military coups, collapsing public trust, and growing anger toward the old foreign powers that once claimed they could stabilize the region. Across the Sahel, entire communities are living between fear and uncertainty, while governments struggle to stop armed groups from expanding deeper into African territory. Yet, in the middle of this dangerous crisis, something unexpected just happened. ECOWAS, the same regional bloc that once tried to isolate Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, has now sent a special envoy directly to Captain Ibrahim Traore and the Alliance of Sahel States. This meeting was not an ordinary diplomatic visit. For many Africans, it was a sign that the balance of power in West Africa is changing faster than anyone expected. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer acting like isolated military governments under pressure. Instead, they are building a new security alliance, tightening borders, launching military operations, and openly challenging the old geopolitical order that dominated the region for decades. At the same time, many ECOWAS countries remain trapped in instability, political division, and worsening insecurity. That reality is forcing difficult questions across Africa. Is the AES becoming a new model for African sovereignty and self-defense? Has the old system already begun to lose control of West Africa? If you believe Africa is entering a new era of sovereignty and resistance, make sure you subscribe and stay with us until the very end. For years, ECOWAS positioned itself as the main authority in West Africa. After the military takeovers in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the organization responded with sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and threats of isolation. Many international observers expected the AES countries to collapse under economic and political pressure. But that never happened. Across the Sahel, terrorism is no longer an isolated crisis, hidden in remote desert regions. It has become a growing wave of instability threatening the entire future of West Africa. Armed groups linked to JNYM, ISGS, Boko Haram, and other extremist networks continue to move across borders with deadly flexibility. Entire villages have been attacked. Thousands of families have been displaced. In many rural communities, people no longer ask whether violence will arrive. They ask when. One of the biggest fears inside the AES today is that weak border control allowed terrorist networks to spread for years without serious resistance. Vast desert routes connecting Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Libya, and northern Nigeria became corridors for weapons trafficking, fuel smuggling, and militant movement. According to many security analysts in the region, open borders without strong security coordination created dangerous vulnerabilities that armed groups exploited repeatedly. This is why Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have dramatically changed their approach. Instead of waiting for international missions or foreign coalitions to secure their territory, the AES governments are increasing military patrols, tightening border checks, expanding intelligence cooperation, and launching more aggressive counterterrorism operations. At the same time, the crisis is spreading beyond the Sahel itself. Countries like Benin and Togo are now facing increasing security threats near their northern borders. Coastal West Africa is beginning to realize that the instability consuming the Sahel could eventually move southward if the region remains divided and weak. For ordinary African families, these geopolitical debates are deeply personal. Parents want children who can safely attend school. Farmers want to work without fear of armed attacks. Traders want roads free from kidnappings and ambushes. In the eyes of many citizens, survival matters more than political slogans. For decades, many Africans were told that Western military partnerships and foreign intervention would eventually bring peace to the Sahel. Foreign bases expanded across the region. International counterterrorism missions operated for years. Billions of dollars were spent in the name of stabilization. Yet, despite all those promises, insecurity continued to spread across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. This growing frustration created a deep crisis of confidence among ordinary citizens. Across many African communities, people started asking difficult questions. If foreign military operations were successful, why were terrorist groups becoming stronger? Why were villages still falling under attack? Why were young Africans still dying while foreign powers claimed to be protecting the region? That frustration opened the door for the rise of the AES. Unlike the older political structures tied closely to foreign influence, the alliance of Sahel states presented itself as something different. It promoted the idea that Africans must defend Africa with their own strength, their own military cooperation, and their own political decisions. For many citizens, that message carried enormous emotional power. The return of Pan-African sentiment has become impossible to ignore. Across social media platforms, radio discussions, and political debates, growing numbers of Africans are expressing support for leaders who openly challenge foreign pressure and demand greater sovereignty. To many supporters, the AES is no longer viewed simply as a military alliance. It is becoming a symbol of resistance, dignity, and self-determination. This does not mean every African fully supports the policies of the AES governments, but many people clearly believe that the old system failed to provide security, stability, or respect for African sovereignty. That belief alone is already reshaping political conversations across West Africa. Among the leaders emerging from the political transformation of the Sahel, Captain Ibrahim Traore has become the most recognized figure across West Africa. To his supporters, he represents a new generation of African leadership that refuses to accept foreign pressure, insecurity, and dependency as permanent realities. To his critics, He represents the growing influence of military rule in regional politics. But regardless of opinion, Ibrahim Traore has already changed the political conversation inside Africa. Unlike many traditional politicians, Traore built his image around military discipline, sovereignty, and direct involvement in the security crisis affecting ordinary citizens. He often appears in military uniform alongside soldiers rather than inside luxurious political settings. That image resonates strongly with many Africans who believe older political elites failed to protect the population from terrorism, corruption, and instability. For supporters of the AES, Traore symbolizes resistance against dependency. His speeches regularly emphasize that Africa must defend its own territory, protect its own resources, and build military strength without relying entirely on foreign powers. Across social media platforms, his popularity has spread far beyond Burkina Faso. Many young Africans now see him as part of a broader Pan-African movement focused on dignity, sovereignty, and self-respect. At the same time, Western governments and international organizations remain concerned about the direction of the AES. Critics argue that military governments could weaken democratic institutions and normalize coups as political solutions. Some analysts also warn that military success alone cannot solve the economic and social problems damaging the Sahel. However, many citizens inside Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger respond with a different argument. They believe security must come first before political reforms can truly succeed. In their eyes, any government that cannot protect roads, villages, and families eventually loses legitimacy. That is why the recent meeting between ECOWAS and Ibrahim Traore carried enormous symbolic importance. Not long ago, the AES leadership was treated as isolated. Today, ECOWAS itself is seeking dialogue, showing that the balance of power in West Africa may already be shifting. As the influence of the AES continues to grow, West Africa is also entering a new geopolitical competition involving outside powers searching for influence across the continent. Russia and Turkey have become two of the most important new partners for Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Unlike the older Western model of intervention, these relationships are often presented as more flexible and based on mutual strategic interests rather than political conditions. Russia has expanded military cooperation with several Sahel governments through training, equipment support, and security partnerships. At the same time, Turkey has increased its presence through defense technology, military cooperation, and economic partnerships. For the AES leadership, these new alliances represent an opportunity to diversify partnerships and reduce dependence on traditional Western powers. However, this shift also raises serious questions. Some critics warn that replacing one foreign dependency with another cannot create true sovereignty. Others argue that African countries must avoid becoming battlegrounds for global power competition between East and West. At the same time, Western governments remain deeply concerned about the rise of the AES. Many fear that the growing popularity of military-led governments could weaken democratic institutions across Africa and inspire similar political movements elsewhere in the region. There are also concerns that continued instability may damage investment, economic growth, and humanitarian conditions. Still, many Africans respond with a different perspective. They argue that promises of democracy mean little when insecurity continues to destroy communities year after year. For them, the real struggle is not simply about elections or alliances. It is about restoring hope, security, and dignity to ordinary people. The future of West Africa may now depend on whether ECOWAS and the AES can find a way to cooperate despite their deep political differences. Terrorist groups do not respect borders, political systems, or regional organizations. As insecurity spreads across the Sahel and toward coastal nations, the pressure for coordination is becoming impossible to ignore. For many analysts, the recent dialogue between ECOWAS and the AES signals the beginning of a new political reality. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer viewed only as isolated military governments under sanctions. They are increasingly being seen as a regional bloc with growing influence, military coordination, and ideological impact across Africa. At the same time, the challenges facing the AES remain enormous. Military operations alone cannot solve poverty, unemployment, weak infrastructure, or the humanitarian crisis affecting millions of people across the Sahel. Long-term stability will require not only security victories, but also economic development, education, and trust between governments and citizens. Still, one lesson has become impossible to ignore. Many Africans now believe that the continent must strengthen its own ability to defend its people, secure its borders, and shape its own political future without permanent dependence on outside powers. West Africa is entering one of the most dangerous and transformative moments in its modern history. The region now stands between two possible futures. One path leads deeper into division, terrorism, foreign manipulation, and endless instability. The other path could lead toward a stronger and more self-reliant Africa capable of defending its own people and controlling its own destiny. The unexpected meeting between ECOWAS and the AES revealed something very important. The political map of West Africa is changing, whether the old powers accept it or not. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have already become major actors shaping the future of the Sahel. Their alliance has forced difficult conversations about sovereignty, security, and the true meaning of African independence in the modern world. At the center of this transformation stands Captain Ibrahim Traore, whose rise has inspired both admiration and controversy across the continent. To many supporters of Pan-African ideals, Ibrahim Traore represents a new generation determined to protect African dignity against insecurity and foreign pressure. Others remain cautious, warning that military power alone cannot guarantee long-term prosperity or democratic stability. But one reality is clear. Millions of Africans are searching for new leadership models because too many old systems fail to deliver peace and security. The growing influence of the AES reflects not only military cooperation, but also a deeper emotional shift happening across Africa's new political consciousness. As the African Union, ECOWAS, and the Alliance of Sahel States navigate this uncertain future, the entire continent is watching closely. The struggle unfolding in Burkina Faso and across the Sahel is no longer only about territory or politics. It is about identity, sovereignty, and the future direction of Pan-Africanism itself. If you believe Africa deserves security, dignity, and sovereignty, subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories shaping the future of the continent. For years, ECOWAS spoke to Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger with the language of pressure. Borders were closed, financial sanctions were imposed, military intervention was openly discussed after the 2023 crisis in Niger. At one point, many people across West Africa believed the region was heading toward a dangerous confrontation between Africans themselves. But today, something has changed. The same ECOWAS that once threatened isolation is now sending mediators directly to Ouagadougou. The visit of veteran diplomat Lansana Kouyaté to meet Captain Ibrahim Traore was not just another diplomatic meeting. It was a powerful signal that the balance of power in West Africa is changing faster than many expected. Because the Alliance of Sahel States, known as AES, did not collapse under pressure. Instead, it survived. It organized. And now, It is forcing the region to adapt to a new reality. Many people in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are watching this moment carefully. They remember the sanctions. They remember the threats. They remember when ECOWAS treated their governments as a problem to be controlled rather than nations demanding sovereignty and respect. That memory has not disappeared. So while the new calls for cooperation are welcomed, they are also met with caution across the Sahel. And perhaps the biggest question now is this: did ECOWAS truly change its position voluntarily? Or did AES become too strong to ignore? Today, we will explore